During the administration of John Adams, the second president of the United States, the Congress enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, a little bit of history. In those days, people didn't run on a political ticket for president and vice president. Everybody ran for president. Whoever got the most electoral votes became president. Whoever got the second most became vice president. Imagine if we had that today. So under the presidency of John Adams, you had the vice president, Thomas Jefferson. They didn't agree on anything.
Right.
John Adams and the Federalists, the big government folks of the day, the antecedents to the present Democratic Party, enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a crime to criticize the president, the cabinet, the Supreme Court, or the Congress. Note who was missing: the vice president. Jefferson didn't care what they said about him, nor would he want any kind of statute preventing people from criticizing him. But think about it. How could the same generation, in some cases the very same human beings who wrote "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech" in the First Amendment, also enact the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a crime to criticize Congress or the President or the Cabinet or the Supreme Court by exercising the freedom of speech? Is there something about liberty that one lusts for it when one is out of power, but power that one is more interested in exercising it when one is inside the government? Well, Congressman Matthew Lyons was a firebrand from Vermont, and he criticized President John Adams for being more interested in the pomp and circumstance of government than in adhering to his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And President Adams, who had a little bit of a problem with his waistline, I can understand that, was referred to by Congressman Lyons as his rotundity. Congressman Lyons was indicted for violating the Alien and Sedition Acts and was prosecuted and convicted by a jury for referring to the president as his rotundity. Now, if you're from New Orleans or Chicago or Boston or New Jersey, you'll appreciate the second half of this story. Congressman Adams ran for re-election to the Congress from his jail cell, and he won. He was in prison in Massachusetts. The good people in Vermont said, "This is ridiculous. We're going to send him back to the House of Representatives." But 21 Americans were prosecuted for criticizing the government, and they went to jail for doing so by the same generation of people who wrote that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. This is repeated throughout our history. The same thing happens during the Civil War, when Lincoln arrests 3,000 newspaper publishers, editors, and journalists from the North. Not people shooting, but people exercising their freedom of speech, and tries them before military commissions because they're too dangerous to bring before juries in federal courthouses. Does this sound familiar? Of course, after Lincoln was dead, the Supreme Court that he had just appointed would unanimously invalidate all of these convictions, because freedom of speech exists even in wartime. And as long as the courts can still exist, we don't use military commissions in this country. And whenever we've done so, they've been invalidated by the courts. The same thing happens in World War I. The Congress enacts the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act makes it a crime to criticize anyone for working in a munitions plant. A guy named Abe Gitlow is an immigrant from Eastern Europe. And he gets, if you're my age, you'll remember this, an old-fashioned mimeograph machine. You remember those? It was a barrel with ink in it. You put a stencil on the outside. And he wrote on the stencil, "If you work in a munitions plant, don't go to work today because the war is illegal." Perfectly protected speech. In his opinion, the war was illegal and immoral. He took these pamphlets and he threw them out of a tenement where he lived and where he had the mimeograph machine on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He was arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and spent the rest of his life in a federal prison for distributing leaflets on the streets of Lower Manhattan. The government was unable to find anybody who read or understood the leaflets. They were written in Yiddish. Nevertheless, he spent the rest of his life in a federal prison and died there for exercising his freedom of speech. Why is it that we let the government do these things? What is it about the government that it thinks that it can trample the very rights that it is sworn to preserve, protect, and defend? In World War II, Franklin Roosevelt arrested 129,000 Japanese Americans and 10,000 Italian Americans, not because they committed a crime, not because they were loyal to the enemy. They were born in the United States of America as he was, but because in his opinion and the opinion of his advisors, he got political points by locking these people up on the theory that they were dangerous, and the Supreme Court let him do that. In 1988, shortly before the end of his term, President Reagan and a Democratic Congress, surprisingly, signed legislation that said this could never happen again. And it condemned the wartime incarceration of people on the basis of their nationality. It condemned the rejection of the natural law. It condemned the idea that Congress can write any law it wants, whether it violates the Constitution or not. And it awarded financial damages to the people who had survived. This was 1988. These events occurred in 1942 and 1943. The other day I was interviewing Congressman James Clyburn. This is the number 3 ranking Democrat in the House. And it wasn't a trick question. I just asked him a basic declaratory question. Congressman Clyburn, where in the Constitution is the federal government authorized to regulate health care? He looked at me like I had 3 heads. And he said, Judge, most of what we do down here, I was in New York, he was in Washington, is not authorized by the Constitution.
Well, at least he admitted.
Where in the Constitution is it prohibited for us to regulate health care? 2 very interesting statements. The first one is a candid recognition of the violation of his oath. Judge, most of what we do down here is not authorized by the Constitution. The second, where is it prohibited, is a very dangerous and troublesome statement. Because this particular member of Congress, and as we know, virtually all Democrats and even some Republicans, think that the Congress is a general legislature. It's not. It doesn't exist in order to right every wrong. It can't regulate any activity it wants. It can't tax anything it wants to tax. It only has the 17 specific, discrete, unique powers given to it in the Constitution. And everything else it can't do.